After Valentine came Gregory IV, who was also elected unanimously. During his papacy, the empire was torn by civil war because of the emperor's 3 sons. After Gregory came Sergius II. Although the people of Rome wanted a deacon named John to be pope, the aristocracy wanted Sergius, so they suppressed opposition quickly and installed Sergius as pope. Sergius' supporters wanted to kill the deacon John, but Pope Sergius intervened to save his life. Nonetheless, John was banished and confined to a monastery. Under Sergius' pontificate, the Arab raid against Rome took place, and Sergius, along with the people of Rome, watched on as parts of Rome were ransacked. The next pope, Leo IV, repaired the damaged churches of Rome and commissioned the Leonine Wall around the Vatican Hill to protect against future raids. Then came Benedict III, then Nicholas the Great, who consolidated papal authority further in a Western Europe that had been falling to pieces. The pope wanted the See of Rome to be seen as the ruler of the church, and as such was the most forceful of the early medieval popes. After Nicholas came Adrian II, then John VIII, who reinforced the walls surrounding the Vatican, since the Muslims were gaining ground in southern Italy. John had little support outside of Rome, and his support inside of Rome dwindled so much that he became the first pope to be assassinated by his own clerics. Next came Pope Marinus I, who along with Marinus II were sometimes called Martin, the second and third respectively. Because of this mistake, the numbering of popes named Martin jumped from Martin I to Martin IV. After Marinus came Adrian III, then Stephen V, who had to contend with famine in Rome, which had become far too common. However, the papal treasury was empty, and so Stephen relied on his father's wealth to help the poor. Then came Formosus, who involved himself in many political disputes, including secretly raising an army to overthrow the new king. Because of this, after his death, one of his successors, Pope Stephen VI, dug him up, dressed him in papal vestments, and put him on trial in what is called the Cadaver Synod. He was found guilty of perjury and of becoming pope illegally. All of Formosus' acts as pope were declared null and void. 3 of his fingers, which he used for blessings, were cut off, and his body was thrown in the Tiber River, which was later retrieved and reburied with honor. The trial was later disregarded by the church, as it was motivated more by political reasons than religious ones. Then came Boniface VI and Stephen VI, who had conducted the Cadaver Synod against Formosus. Stephen was later imprisoned in an insurrection and strangled to death. His successor Romanos annulled Stephen's papal acts. His cause of death is unknown, but he might have been deposed by supporters of Stephen. Then came Theodore II, who in his short 20 days of being pope managed to annul the Cadaver Synod and reinstate Pope Formosus' acts. Upon Theodore's death, 2 men attempted to be elected pope, Sergius and John, with John winning out, and John IX excommunicated Sergius. Sergius thus left the city only to return years later to be elected as one of John's successors. After John came Benedict IV, then Leo V, who was imprisoned by the cardinal priest Christopher, who then declared himself pope. Pope Leo and anti-pope Christopher were both strangled to death at the orders of Sergius III, who became the next pope. With the election of Sergius, the papacy entered into a period now called Saeculum Obscurum, Latin for the Dark Age, a period of 60 years in which the papacy was controlled by a corrupt aristocratic family. It was the lowest point of the papacy up to then. Then came Anastasius III, then Lando, then John X, who tried to stand against the aristocratic control of the papacy and unify Italy, but was ultimately murdered because of it. Then Leo VI, then Stephen VII, then John XI, whose mother was the aristocrat Marozia, the most powerful woman in Italy, whose influence made John's election possible. Then came Leo VII, then Stephen VIII, then Marinus II, then Agapitus II. Then John XII. He's depicted as a harsh, immoral man. His papal palace was described as a brothel. He crowned the German king Otto the Great as Holy Roman Emperor, but eventually he became afraid of Otto's power and conspired against him. Upon finding this out, Otto besieged Rome and called a council to depose John. They elected Leo in his place, another anti-pope, who would eventually become pope legally. Pope John XII, for his part, apparently died on one of his adulterous sexual encounters outside of Rome. Then came Benedict V, who was elected by the people of Rome, who were unhappy with Emperor Otto's choice of Leo. Otto in turn was not happy about this, so he besieged Rome again, blockading it so that no one could enter or leave. A famine ensued. The people eventually opened the gates to Otto and gave up Benedict. He was brought to a meeting which Leo had convened. With the promise that Otto would spare his life, Benedict threw himself at anti-pope Leo's feet. It is at this point that the church now says that Benedict legally abdicated and Leo became the true pope, Leo VIII. Then came John XIII, noted for his piety, goodness, and scholarly knowledge of scripture and canon law. Then Benedict VI, who was seen as Emperor Otto's puppet. Otto died soon after Benedict's election, giving Rome's aristocrats the chance to imprison Benedict and install anti-Pope Boniface. Upon hearing of this, Otto II sent a representative to demand his release. Boniface would not, and instead ordered a priest to strangle Benedict in prison. After Benedict VI was murdered, Benedict VII was elected by the people of Rome with the emperor's support, and anti-Pope Boniface was forced to flee. After Benedict came John XIV. Otto II was unable to protect John because he died, and the new emperor, Otto III, was only 3 years old. So Boniface came back to Rome and imprisoned John, where he died from poisoning or starvation. Then came John XV, the first pope to canonize a saint. Then Gregory V, who had opposition from the Roman nobility, who elected their own pope, anti-Pope John. Then after Gregory died under suspicious circumstances, Pope Sylvester II, the first French pope, was elected. He was a scholar, teacher, scientist, humanist, and promoter of the study of Arab and Greco-Roman math and astronomy, and studied philosophy. He was a Renaissance man long before the Renaissance. Following him came John XVII, then John XVIII, who eventually abdicated. Then Sergius IV became pope, who might have been murdered. Tough job. And after Sergius came Benedict VIII, who had opposition from a small faction who elected an anti-Pope Gregory to oppose him. But soon Benedict gained the support of the German king Henry II, and Benedict crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. After Benedict died, his brother was elected Pope, John XIX. Because he was a layman, he had to be consecrated deacon, priest, and bishop before taking the chair. Upon his death, the papacy was the subject of dispute between rival factions. First, John's nephew Benedict became pope, who was young, unqualified, and lived a life full of debauchery, and so he resigned when he was driven out of Rome by a revolt of the people of Rome. And they then elected Sylvester III. Benedict tried to take his position back and excommunicated Sylvester. Sylvester just returned back to his previous diocese to continue as the bishop there, and Benedict, doubtful of his ability to remain in office, decided to abdicate and offered to sell the papacy to his godfather, John Gratian, who bought it and became Pope Gregory VI. Benedict later regretted his decision and returned to Rome to assert his claim. At this time, Sylvester III also reasserted his claim. It was a mess. Each of them had supporters and each of them had control of a portion of the city, and so the people of Rome implored Emperor Henry III to restore order, and so Henry called the Council of Sutri. The council dismissed all three claimants and declared the office of the pope empty. So Henry looked for a new pope. First he turned to Adalbert, the Archbishop of Bremen, who refused. So then he turned to his personal confessor, Suger, who became Clement II. After Clement died, Benedict yet again asserted a claim to the papacy and actually took control, but at the threat of the emperor, Benedict was forcibly expelled, and the emperor's choice of Pope, Damasus II, was installed, although he died 23 days later, probably from malaria. Then Leo IX was chosen to be Pope by an assembly in Germany, and the emperor agreed. However, Leo favored an election according to church law by the people and clergy of Rome, and so before he could accept, he wanted a free election by them, and when he returned to Rome, he was thus elected. One of his first acts as pope was to require the celibacy of the clergy again, and he made clear that he was against any and all kinds of simony, that is, the sale of church privileges. The primacy of Rome and the pope had long been a point of contention between the eastern and western parts of the church. Under Leo, Greek churches in Italy were forced to conform to the Latin way of doing things, and in response, the Patriarch of Constantinople ordered Latin churches in the east to be closed. Leo sent a delegation to the Patriarch to negotiate and again assert the status of the Pope and Rome as head of all Christian churches. Negotiations quickly broke down, and Leo's delegation excommunicated the Patriarch, which technically wasn't a legal excommunication because when they delivered it, Leo had already died. In response, the Patriarch excommunicated the papal delegation. This is seen as the official split of the Christian church between the East and West, or what is now called the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. After Leo came Victor II, then Stephen IX, then Nicholas II, who had anti-Pope Benedict as opposition to his papacy. Anti-Pope Benedict was eventually made to renounce his claim, and he was tried and imprisoned in a hospital until his death. Pope Nicholas called a synod to impose new regulations on papal elections, one of which was that the Roman citizens could no longer vote for the next pope. This privilege was limited to the College of Cardinals, as it is today, and so after Nicholas died, the cardinals assembled and chose Alexander II to be pope. Alexander was a member of the Reform movement. Some German and Lombard bishops who were opposed to reform assembled assembled to elect their own person, Antipope Honorius. Unlike some of his predecessors who were hostile to Jews, Alexander praised those who protected Jews in Christendom, reminding people that God does not approve of spilling innocent blood, and that conversion by force was not allowed. He introduced the practice of not saying the Alleluia during the penitential season of Lent, which is still done today. After Alexander came Gregory VII, a great reforming pope. He championed the supremacy of the papacy, conflicting with the emperor and political powers to the point that he excommunicated the emperor 3 times. They fought about who had the power to appoint local church leaders, like bishops, with the pope claiming the privilege. The emperor in response appointed anti-pope Clement to oppose Gregory. Following Gregory was Victor III, a more moderate pope. He didn't even want the job, and when he had heard that the cardinals were planning on imposing the papacy on him, he fled, but they were persistent. Eventually he accepted. After Victor came Urban II, who started the First Crusade to aid the Byzantine Empire in fighting off the Seljuk Turks and recapturing Jerusalem from the Fatimid Caliphate, and thus establishing the First Kingdom of Jerusalem. He promised a forgiveness of sins to anyone that fought against the Muslims' conquest in these areas and against the Moors in Spain. Pope Urban also set up the Roman Curia, the administrative arm of the church to govern church affairs. After Urban came Pope Paschal II. Under his reign, there were more crusades, more disagreements with the new emperor, and reconciliation was attempted with the Orthodox Church, and the first bishop in the Americas was appointed. Under Paschal, nearly 4 centuries before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, a certain Eric Knudsen was made Bishop of Greenland and what is now Newfoundland, Canada. During Paschal's time as Pope, there were 4 consecutive anti-popes, starting with Clement, who began his anti-popeness back when Gregory VII was Pope. When he died, his supporters gathered in secret and elected anti-pope Theodoric, who was quickly brought before Pope Paschal to be condemned and imprisoned to live out his days in a monastery. So his supporters elected another guy, Albert, who was also imprisoned to live out his days in a monastery. But the anti-popeness doesn't end there. While Pope Paschal was away from Rome one day, members of the Roman aristocracy, with the support of Emperor Henry V, elected Sylvester. Eventually, Sylvester abandoned his claim, since the emperor had just used him to put pressure on Paschal to submit to his demands on who could appoint local church leaders, which had continued to be a point of contention between the church and the state for decades. Then came Galatius II, who inherited this same problem. Upon his election, he was captured by supporters of the emperor, but freed by an uprising of the Roman populace. Later, he was driven out of Rome by the emperor, who appointed anti-pope Gregory to replace him. While in exile, Galatius planned to hold a meeting to finally settle the issue of church versus state power, but he died before doing so. So his successor, Calixtus II, settled it at the Concordat of Worms. Pope Calixtus also issued a papal bull about the official position of the papacy concerning the treatment of Jews, saying that they should enjoy their lawful liberty. It prohibited Christians, under penalty of excommunication, from forcing Jews to convert, or from disturbing their property, cemeteries, or interfering with their celebrations. Next came Pope Honorius II. Technically, anti-Pope Celestine II was elected legitimately, but moments after he was elected, he was attacked by a body of troops who burst into the chapel, and Celestine was willing to resign, so I don't know why they call him anti-Pope Celestine, because he was technically the real Pope. Anyways, not important. In the confusion, Pope Honorius II was elected as well. So confusion continued for a few days until finally everyone supported Pope Honorius, but he didn't want to accept the throne because of the confusion. So he resigned so that there could be a clean start, and he was immediately re-elected unanimously. Notably, it was Pope Honorius who approved the new military order, the Knights Templar. Quickly and rather hastily after Honorius's death, Pope Innocent II was elected. Some of the cardinals, however, declared that it was not a legal election, and so they elected their own, anti-Pope Anacletus II, who would oppose the Pope for a majority of his pontificate. After Innocent came Celestine II, then Lucius II, who was killed by a stone that hit his head after a revolt took Rome and he attempted to retake it. Then Eugene III, who was not able to live in Rome for most of his reign because of the revolt by the citizens of Rome, hostile to the increasing power of the papacy and the ingrained power of the nobility. The rebels established the Commune of Rome, which organized the Roman government similar to that of the classical Roman Republic. Then came Anastasius IV, then Adrian IV, who because of the unrest in Rome and after the murder of a cardinal, put the city under interdict, meaning that most of the church services in Rome were stopped, with baptism being one of the few exceptions. This greatly affected the daily lives of Roman citizens. Even the economy of Rome was suffering, since the seasonal influx of pilgrims diminished because there were no church services. Then Alexander III was elected, the only Briton to ever hold the office. But again, as many times before, an opposition arose who elected their own pope, Anti-Pope Victor. And because Pope Alexander's pontificate lasted nearly 21 years, he survived not only Anti-Pope Victor, but his successors as well, Anti-Popes Paschal, Calixtus, and Innocent. Then came Lucius the Third, who fought with the emperor, same old, same old. His successor, Pope Urban III, continued the fight. Then finally Gregory VIII restored a friendly relationship with the emperor. Then came Clement III, then Celestine III, then Innocent III, who asserted the absolute power of the papacy over the kings of Europe, while still respecting their authority, if they respected his. He also spent most of his pontificate preparing for another crusade on the Holy Land. To raise money for this endeavor, he did something no other pope had done before, impose a direct tax on the clergy. They were ordered to give 1/40th of their income to support the crusade. It was also under Innocent III that Francis of Assisi, now one of the Catholic Church's most well-known saints, came to Rome to seek permission from the pope to establish a new religious order, the Franciscans. The Pope wasn't too sure about this, as there had been some issues with new religious orders being heretical and insubordinate to the Pope, but after he had a dream where he saw Francis holding up the Basilica of St. John Lateran, that is, the Pope's cathedral, he approved the new order. Towards the end of his pontificate, Innocent opened the Fourth Lateran Council, considered to be the most important church council of the Middle Ages. It encouraged the creation of schools and holding clergy to a higher standard. The changing of the bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ was defined using the term transubstantiation. The appointing of Jews to public offices was discouraged so that they would not have power over Christians. It also said that Jews and Muslims should wear different clothes so that Christians wouldn't accidentally marry them. It also said that Jews and Muslims shouldn't go out in public the week before Easter, but especially on Good Friday. The council also set the beginning of the next crusade for 1217, but the Pope would not live to see that day, because he dies in 1216. It was Pope Honorius III who would see the start of the Fifth Crusade. To fund this latest crusade, the Pope and the cardinals were to give up 1/10 of their income for 3 years, and all other clergy would give 1/20th. This crusade proved to be a failure for Christians, with the Muslims retaining their lands. Pope Honorius also approved religious orders still in existence today, namely the Dominicans and the Carmelites. Next came Pope Gregory IX, who established the Papal Inquisition to bring order to the process of dealing with heresy, since it had become normal for mobs to burn heretics without a trial. It was the Pope's intention that his Inquisition would investigate alleged heretics and teach them correct doctrine, and if they didn't accept this, they would be given to the civil authority, because heresy was a crime. Then Celestine IV became Pope for 16 days. Then after about a year and a half of the office being empty, Innocent IV was finally elected. He is credited with helping create the idea of the legal person, that is, a non-natural person for purposes of organization, for example, corporations of today. This was done so monks who took vows of poverty and pledged not to own property could nonetheless control their infrastructure and pass it down to future monks through these legal persons. It helped provide stability. After Innocent came Alexander IV, then Pope Urban IV, who instituted the feast of Corpus Christi. Then came Clement IV, and after Clement, the office was vacant for 3 years, the longest time without a pope, due in part to the political infighting of the cardinals. It got so bad that their food rations were reduced to bread and water to force them to elect. 3 cardinals died and 1 resigned by the time they compromised, and elected Pope Gregory X, who was not a cardinal or bishop or even a priest at the time. And when he heard the news of his election, he was busy in the 9th Crusade in Palestine with King Edward I of England, and although he was hesitant to leave the crusade, he returned to Italy to accept his election. After Gregory, Innocent V was elected, then Adrian V, then John the 21st. Although the previous pope to take the name John was John the 19th, historians at the time misread papal records and concluded that there was another Pope John between John the 14th and 15th, So Pope John the 21st thought he was correcting a counting error, but it turned out that he was in fact introducing a counting error. He died soon after his apartment collapsed while he was in it. Then Nicholas the Third was elected, who was known for his excessive nepotism, elevating his relatives to important positions in the church. In the epic poem Dante's Inferno, Pope Nicholas is seen in hell, buried headfirst in holes, with fires on the soles of his feet. After him came Martin IV, then Honorius IV, who was really old and unable to walk or stand. After Honorius, the 13 cardinals convened to elect the next pope, but then 6 of them died. So they left for a few months and reconvened to elect Nicholas IV, who was reluctant to accept, but eventually he did, and after he died, the papacy was vacant for 2 years, as the 11 cardinals deliberated. They finally elected Celestine V, another non-cardinal, who was a hermit monk unprepared for papal duties. One of his only decrees was asserting the rights of popes to resign, and a week after he did just that, stating that he wished to return to his more tranquil former life. He would be the last pope to resign before the recent Pope Benedict XVI in 2013. Then Boniface VIII was elected, remembered for organizing the first Catholic Jubilee year in Rome, and for his feud with the French King Philip IV, whom he excommunicated, culminating with an army sent by the king arriving at the Pope's palace and slapping the 73-year-old Pope, who died a month later. Then Benedict XI was elected, who was actually the 10th legitimate Pope to take the name Benedict, but at the time, anti-Pope Benedict X was thought to be legitimate, but not today. So everyone from Benedict XI to the recent Benedict XVI were actually the 10th through the 15th. Then, after influence from the French king, the cardinals elected the French Clement V, who refused to move to Rome and moved the papacy to Avignon, France, where it would remain for the next 67 years, in which 7 popes reigned under the influence of the French crown, a period known as the Avignon Papacy. After Clement died, the papacy was vacant for 2 years. Eventually, John the 22nd was elected, then Benedict XII. Now the 3rd pope in Avignon, France, he ordered a papal palace be constructed in Avignon. Then came Clement VI, who reigned when the Black Plague first struck Europe. Clement attributed this plague to divine wrath, although in popular opinion, the Jews were somehow blamed. Clement did not accept this. He condemned those who blamed the Jews, saying that those who believed that were seduced by that liar the devil, because many parts of the world were being afflicted, even those who didn't live with Jews, and even Jews were getting sick. The Pope also granted absolution of the sins of all those who died from the plague. After Clement came Innocent VI, then Urban V, who lived a simple, modest life, unlike his predecessor Avignon popes, who lived princely lives. He was a reformer who patronized education by founding and supporting universities and schools across Europe.